Alex Deane is a writer, political commentator and consultant, served as Chief of Staff to David Cameron when he was Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Good morning, Alex.
Morning, Nicky. Morning, Ellie.
And Archie Bland, Guardian's Deputy National Editor. Good morning, Archie.
Good morning.
So you're in bed with the Daily Mail this morning.
I wish I was in bed. I'm talking to you guys instead.
There's perhaps better people to be in bed with. That's arguable. Alex Deane, make the case. Be counsel for the defence, please, for Mr. Cummings.
Well, I think he's agreed and conceded he made the first trip that is being discussed, and in my view at least, there was provision at the time in the guidance that was given by government for exceptional travel, especially if you're caring for vulnerable people, a category which included children and certainly autistic children. If the second allegation that is now being made, and you've rightly pointed out it's been denied, if the second allegation is true and he's lied about that, then he's toast. But if he's telling the truth, then I think he will survive and should survive. And furthermore, I think he's entitled to the presumption of innocence and have his defence heard, rather than people reporting as fact that which is alleged.
Archie, we had there an outlining from Alex of a specific aspect to the personal circumstances which haven't been perhaps broadly understood. How do you respond to the substance of what he said?
So I think it's important to say that in terms of laying out the facts and of establishing all of the details of what happened here, the government has had every opportunity to do that throughout the process, on or off the record, with The Guardian and the Daily Mirror. And that simply hasn't happened. I think it's also worth saying that as well as the questions that people will have about the availability of childcare anywhere closer than 250 miles plus away from home when sick, people will also have substantial questions about a trip which Dominic Cummings has now accepted that he took to Barnard Castle, 30 miles away from where he was supposedly going through lockdown on his wife's birthday to visit a English heritage town with an English heritage site in the middle of it. And he has denied the second trip, which an eyewitness has said that they saw him making later, so we'll see where that goes. But I just think it's important to say that there is a question about consistency here. And, if you had asked any cabinet minister on Friday morning or earlier in the week whether they thought that this kind of trip was acceptable, I think they would have given a pretty unequivocal no. After it was revealed that Dominic Cummings had taken such a trip, their answer got a lot more complicated. And, that seems to me to make it very difficult to apply lockdown in a universal and straightforward way.
Alex Deane?
Yeah, I think the point about whether the case has been explained well enough by government is a fair one. And also, Archie's right. If the allegations are made and they are denied, the media is entitled to test them. And I think that's a reasonable point. On the point about whether childcare would be available more closely to them, though, I defy you to find any parent who would prefer their child to go into any form of care from the state or any form of care with strangers rather than close family. Anyone would want their child to be looked after or have relatives close by, I think.
Does his wife not have relatives close by?
Yeah, and if you don't have relatives close by, then they're far away, right?
I'm just wondering if Mr. Cummings' wife has relatives close by.
I don't know, and nor do you, right?
No.
That's right. So I don't know why people leap to assume the worst rather than taking at face value a parent trying to do their best in unpleasant circumstances.
Well, yeah, the thing is, some people are saying it's a touch of the George Orwell's about it. All animals are equal, some more equal than others. A touch of the Breaking Bads as well. Whatever I did it for my wife and family. Yeah,
look, I don't deny that the government is now spent more time on this than it would wish to, and obviously it's you're on the back foot, right? No one's pretending this is a rosy situation, and furthermore, I'd say this is an increasingly high stakes game. I bet on this at least Archie and I agree. Number 10 has dug in no uncertain terms. They will now not want to be seen to give in to those pushing this case, and I will also say, this far into a story that hasn't gone away, somebody normally resigns. So this is unusual. And this is now becoming, I think, a clash between the PM and his critics. But if you turn that around and think about why people are so interested and excited about it, at least part of I accept that it's a terrible look for government and for Cummings himself. But even outside of this specific case that's being discussed, I think people are going to town on this because they don't like Dominic Cummings and and because they don't like the Brexit he delivered, and because they see it as a route of attacking the Prime Minister. And to that extent,
that doesn't explain the likes of Steve Baker and others as well.
No, but
who
Steve
are
Baker's
firm Brexiteers who are attacking Mr. Cummings.
Who was in the trenches with me on Brexit, and he's someone I know and like, and has admirably never hidden for a moment his intense personal dislike for Dominic Cummings. It's sort of the opening and closing of any discussion he has on the issue. So there is a background there that Steve would be the first to concede. But I think more broadly, the reason that papers like Archie's and others are going for this is at least in part because of what Cummings represents and because of his closeness to the PM. And naturally, that attracts supporters as well as detractors.
So if he were a less divisive figure, Archie Bland, there would not be such a, as we say north of the border, such a stooshy.
I think on its face, or if you look at, for example, the case of the chief medical advisor in Scotland, of Neil Ferguson, who've also had to resign, or who have had to resign over these kinds of questions, I think it's self-evidently true that this is not a partial thing. This is about reporting. And I think it is really worth saying that there are obviously people in whose interests it is to present this as a culture war, to suggest that you have to pick your side in this because you're either with this person or with that person, and deciding which side you're on is what defines whether you think that it's right for Dominic Cummings to resign or not. That is actually not in any way our agenda. It is incredibly important to hold people like Dominic Cummings to account because they're at the centre of the decision-making process, and because it's extremely important that people understand the lockdown is being applied in a consistent and fair way. It's also, by the way, not for us to decide, certainly not for me to decide whether or not Dominic Cummings should resign. It's just to lay out the facts, which has been very difficult to do because of the continued refusal of Downing Street and Dominic Cummings to provide them.
Nikki, I accept that it's Archie's job to hold people to account, and furthermore, I accept that they should be getting more disclosure than they're getting. I've sought to be reasonable, and I've absolutely conceded it's not a good look, but I think that on this question about comparisons, this is where anyone wishing to take a broader view and perhaps defend Cummings is on the firmest ground, because it is not like going to your second home for fun, or it's not like having your lover come over to your house for fun.
But the instincts of every parent, what about the instincts of every parent to go and see their children across the country over the past few weeks, for every parent to go and see their loved ones at the end of the country, every parent to go and see their mother or father last time before they die in a care home? This is why it sticks in the craw of so many people, why so many people are incandescent. And also, Mr. Cummings himself has made great play over recent years, exploiting the idea that there is an out-of-touch political elite that live by separate rules to the rest of us.
Yes. I think it's also worth saying in response to that, it is, if this is indeed such an above-board thing, then I don't quite understand why it wasn't included in the Spectator articles that he and his wife wrote that they had made this trip. It's also worth saying...
Let's explain that. His wife wrote an article.
His wife wrote an article for the Spectator describing lockdown, and if you read that article, you certainly would have had the impression that they were at home. Dominic Cummings wrote an accompanying short piece. In neither of those things did it make any reference to travelling across the country, and you have to ask why they didn't feel that was appropriate for public consumption.
Interesting, Alex Deane. That is a fairly significant part of one's life if one is in lockdown and then one travels 250 miles with one's husband and one's son. You'd think that if you were writing a little diary about the lockdown experience, might just mention that if you thought everything was above board, Alex Deane.
You've had an interesting exchange, and I'll just go to the first point that you made between you, which was about how emotional people feel about it, about these circumstances. And without, I try to be as dispassionate and look at the facts as best I can, but I, like everyone else, have a family, and I don't like lockdown. I haven't seen my elderly and not particularly well parents for some time either. But it's not a competition in these things, and there is a difference between wanting to do something and needing to do it. I want to see my parents, but I don't need to see them today, tomorrow, or this week. Whereas if you're seeking to care for someone who is unambiguously in a category of vulnerability, which is a point I think has been under-canvassed in this discussion.
Just to highlight that finally, if it's been under-canvassed, just emphasise it before we move on.
Well, as I understand it, Dominic Cummings' child has a medical condition which means that the care for that child is more strenuous and difficult than it might otherwise be. And that would normally be something that's a private matter in their own business, and it's having to be dragged out in public, and I dare say they dislike that just as much as they dislike people howling abuse at them in the streets. But my point is that that if you need to care for your child and you need to go 250 miles, then you do. He's entitled to have that case heard.
I think it's really important. Can I just jump in very briefly to say that whatever one thinks about a 250-mile trip for childcare, which you do not in fact use when you get there, there is another question about whether a 30-mile trip to a tourist destination is appropriate when it's nowhere near the place where you are spending your lockdown, or indeed near your actual home, whether you were well or not. And there's never been any answer yet to the question of why that was justified.
A lot of exposure to the virus going on as well. That was most interesting. I really appreciate both of you coming on this morning on 5 Live Breakfast. Alex, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Nicky.